Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Museum Show and Tell Show. My name's Nicole. I'm from the Penetanguishene Centennial Museum, and I'm here with Genevieve from the Huronia Museum. And in today's episode, I had challenged Huronia Museum to look at some of our hat collection because it's Easter this weekend, and usually people have some really neat Easter hats. And so that's the theme I came up with. And I decided to go with a very known artifact in our collection. First of all, I'm going to start off with the hat box, a very nice leather box. And on the top, it says G.A.B. And that is George Adden Beck. And he was the son of Charles Beck, who was the one that donated or had the general store here. And he was born in 1887 and he died in 1960. And so this held his very fancy top hat that is actually made out of beaver pelt. So when we talk about, the big craze when it came to the beaver pelt industry, it was because of the male hat that was, basically all male hats were made, nice hats were made out of beaver pelt from like the 1500s to the 1800s. And so this was like very popular in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And if you see inside, it was actually made in England, and Henry Heath Limited, which is a very kind of famous top hat maker, and by warrant to His Majesty the King, Henry Heath Limited in Piccadilly in England. So this would have been quite, the hat of the time to got it from England, probably when one of the royal families, preferred hat makers. And he also has in here another hat, which these are also called opera hats.
Oh, that's awesome.
And these would have been used, especially they were called opera hats because they would wear them when they would go into the opera house. But once they were in the opera house, they had to take all their hats off and they had to sort of tuck them away. And so it was a lot easier to tuck them away.
It collapses.
So, if there's gonna, you wanted that look of the prestige of the beaver pelt hat, but sometimes, you would just want to wear something like this and have the look of it so someone would think it's your beaver pelt hat, but it wasn't, and you could tuck it in. So that was that's tucked in here as well. So these are the two items. And then he also had a brush in here. He also had garters in this box as well. And I'm sure this was just for all of his fancy events that he would be going to. We do have a couple photos of Charles Beck. George Beck. Unfortunately, we don't have any with him wearing the hat. But he was the youngest child in the Beck family. So in here, he would have been the little guy in the middle.
Aww,
and interesting enough, so out of all the children, if you see all of Charles Beck's children, the son that actually took over his business was George, the youngest. So some of the older sons actually passed away before they could take over the business. And then, it was left with the youngest. He had the most business sense to take over the business. But obviously he liked the fine things in life as well. So that's my artifact for today. So what's your artifact?
I brought in something interesting, sort of goes along the line of something that's drawn, I guess, from an animal. This hat, I'm not so sure that you'd want to wear it in an Easter parade. In my eyes, it's rather gloomy, although it certainly was very fashionable. And so what I brought in, and it's a woman's hat. It's like I guess in a toque shape. And a toque is really just a narrow or a brimless hat. And it has been entirely decorated with the feathers of a Eurasian jackdaw.
Oh,
And people's hats had probably starting in about the 14th century is when people started to use feathers as decoration for their hat. And you'll see a lot of it historically more, I guess, visually arresting hats. Like these ones here in our 1910, 1911 Hudson's Bay. So you can see we've got the ostrich feathers, we've got complete sets of wings, larger, I guess, more, yeah, visually arresting, like I'd said.
yeah.
Arrangements, eye-catching feathers. So you'd see a lot of exotic birds. Outside of ostriches, there'd be parrots, pairs of birds of paradise, very fine egret feathers. So we think this hat dates to about 1880 or so. We're not entirely sure. It's difficult to tell because a lot of the material that you find in catalogs or in women's magazines show, I guess, the fancier, larger hats. And this one, I have to say, although it is finely made and entirely covered with bird feathers, which couldn't have been an easy thing to do, to arrange them without any kind of thread showing, to the threads that were used to hold them down. It is a kind of pedestrian hat. It's not as eye-catching, I guess, as the larger hats that you'd see in the department store catalogs. And this actually, the use of entire birds like this led to a real boom in the taxidermy field. Really well-trained and skilled taxidermists were required to set the birds in natural poses. Sometimes when you shook your hat or as you gently walked, the birds would, their feathers would, or their wings would maybe swoop, or the birds would just look like they're in really natural poses. So yeah, here we are. I like this hat a lot, but it's not really, yes, Easter, I think. Yeah, it's not the kind of thing that you definitely want to wear in an Easter parade. To be honestly, just by using a Eurasian jackdaw as well, it's not it's sort of an everyday bird. It's like a grackle or a starling in your backyard.
Okay.
It's definitely not a eye-catching bird. And it's a bit gloomy.
Face.
So
like you can
yes,
see the eye and the beak. There's the beak there, right?
Yes, it is.
Hard, but the
Yeah,
beak's black.
I think it's
Wow.
a fake beak, and I think it's been painted over, or possibly it's been chipped. But anyway, his eye looks a bit reproachful, so I don't think he's very happy sitting on top of that hat. And I believe also that it looks to me like there is certainly more than one jackdaw involved in that hat. Is more feathers than would be required, and that actually led that this whole it was a multi-million-dollar industry across the international industry across the world, and it led to near extinction of a lot of different types of birds until I guess the early 19th century. There were a number of women who realized exactly what was happening, and they started preservation societies in order to put an end to this. The hunting of these birds. And a lot of times parent birds were killed, leaving babies in their nest to starve to death. It was a real wholesale slaughter, really, of different types of eye-catching birds across the world. So maybe that's why they took this poor jackdaw.
It's interesting
the
because in
others
our
had been outlawed.
collection, we have a lot of those fancy hats of the past. And I know Jan's done another, show and tell about it,
Yeah.
showing with the feathers, like a little fake bird. We don't have anything with like real birds, right? And you obviously have one. Do you have a lot? Like, where are all these hats, that were made, like those big hats? Like, I wonder if there's some museums out there that have a large collection of them, because I've never seen the big bird hats like on display.
Some really big museums like the Met, they have really amazing collections. Apparently when egrets were mating during the mating season, they had these really fine, very fine feathers. They're almost gossamer, and they've got some, you could call them hats. They're almost like a tiara, a very fine silver or metal band, I guess, with these egret feathers that are lifting. It's beautiful. It's amazing that something like that could survive. It's just so fine and breakable looking. But yeah, it looks like in larger museums they seem to. And honestly, I think a lot of hats like that, maybe the base of the hat or the hat itself would have been kept, but as fashion changes, ladies would remove the earlier seasons decorative items, whether that was lace or flowers. I know flowers were very, very common, and a lot of our ledgers in our general stores here would have a lot of trimmings for your hats, and they'd be selling different things seasonally. So you got dried flowers or silk flowers, some feathers. It didn't seem like there was a lot of lace and trimmings. So yeah, so it might have been that rather than the change of fashion that led to them not surviving in this collection. Yeah, the hats that we have for the most part are straw hats, bonnets, but we don't really have a lot of those fine hats or any of those fine hats in our collection.
Yeah, you're right. That's probably what they just reused, because I know, especially, in the early 1900s, like the fur shawl with the animals with the faces on it was very in fashion in the 30s and 40s.
Yes.
And I think a lot, you probably have some of those in your collection. I know we do, but
yes.
A lot of them would have been reused too, right, over time, because that was definitely not in fashion for very long. So
no, and honestly, there's a real sense of recycling, and historically anyway, a lot did get thrown out. I mean, in the archaeological record certainly shows us that, but yeah, it makes sense to reuse your clothes or restyle them. Just cut the stitching out and rework it into something different, or cut it down to make clothing for your children. Yes. And then ultimately a quilt.
Yes. All right. So that was a pretty interesting episode with two very different hats. So what is our theme for next week?
Thinking maybe we can continue on with this animal theme, and so bring something else in that's related to animals, whether it's animal husbandry, clothing made of animal skin, leather, anything, or even a photograph of a cherished pet.
All right. Oh, sounds good. All right. So we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.